What if I told you that the most famous fact about the Middle Ages is a lie? You've heard it before. People only live to 30. But here's the question that changes everything. If the average person died at 30, why do medieval records show so many people living into their 50s, 60s, and even 70s? And more importantly, what does that number actually hide? Before you answer, take a moment. Like this video and subscribe to Little Historical, because the truth about medieval life expectancy isn't what you think. Stay with me. Let's walk through the real story. You've heard the number your entire life. 30. That's how long a medieval person was supposed to last. And on the surface, it feels right, doesn't it? A brutal world. No antibiotics. No modern medicine. Constant war and famine. Surely people just wore out young. But here's where the story gets uncomfortable in a way most storytellers never admit. That number isn't telling you what you think it's telling you. It's not a gravestone. It's a mathematical ghost. You see, an average is a sneaky thing. It takes every single death and pulls them all together into one tidy, misleading figure. And in the Middle Ages, one group died so early and so often that they dragged the entire average down with them like a weight tied to a sinking ship. We are talking about infants, newborns, children who never saw their 5th birthday. Their deaths were not rare. They were expected. And every single one of those tiny, heartbreaking losses pulled the average toward the ground. So when you hear 30, what you're really hearing is a world where nearly half of all children never became adults. That's the secret hiding inside the statistic. The adults who survived childhood, many of them lived to 50, 60, even 70 years old. They had wrinkles. They had bad knees. They had opinions about the younger generation. They were not fragile. They were the ones who had already survived the worst the world could throw at them. So why does the myth persist? Why do we keep repeating that 30-year lie? Because it's easier to imagine a short, brutal life than to sit with a much stranger truth, that medieval people didn't die young on purpose. They died young by lottery. And that lottery was rigged from the very first breath. But here's what we haven't talked about yet. What actually killed those children? What made the first 5 years so much deadlier than the next 50? That's where the real darkness lives. And that's exactly where we are going next. You wanted to know what actually killed those children. What made the first 5 years so much deadlier than the next 50? Let's begin with the very first moment of life outside the womb. Birth in the Middle Ages was not a celebration. It was a negotiation with fate. The mother lay on a straw bed, surrounded by women who had seen too many endings. No doctors. No antiseptics. Just experience, prayer, and hope. If the baby came out wrong, breech, tangled, too still, there was almost nothing anyone could do but wait and whisper. And even when the first cry came, that was not safety. That was merely permission to begin the real danger. The first hour. The first night. The first week. Each one was a silent test that many failed. Without clean water, without understanding of germs, a simple umbilical infection could turn a healthy newborn into a feverish memory within days. Mothers watched their infants with an intensity we cannot fully understand today. Not paranoia. Experience. They had buried children before. They would likely bury more. So they delayed naming ceremonies. They hesitated to bond too openly. Not because they didn't love. Because loving someone you might lose by morning required a different kind of courage. Then came childhood proper. Not play. Work. Toddlers near cooking fires. Young children collecting water from contaminated streams. 4-year-olds pulling weeds beside oxen that could crush them with one wrong step. Every day brought a new chance for tragedy. A fall into a well, a burn that festered, a fever that arrived at sunset and ended by dawn. And the diseases, measles, dysentery, smallpox, swept through villages like invisible executioners. No one knew how they spread. No one knew how to stop them. They only knew that one household would be spared while the one next door buried 3 children in a single week. That randomness, that cruelty without reason, shaped every parent heartbeat. You did not raise a child. You prayed for one. And if they reached age 10, you didn't celebrate loudly. You exhaled. Just a little. Because the worst was finally behind them. Or so you hoped. Because even surviving childhood did not mean safety. It only meant the odds had finally stopped laughing. And that leads us to the next question. What happened to those who actually made it through? You hoped. Because even surviving childhood did not mean safety. It only meant the odds had finally stopped laughing. And that leads us to the next question. What happened to those who actually made it through? The answer is stranger than any medieval myth you've heard. Once a child passed the age of 10 or 12, something quietly shifted. The body, if it had been fed just enough and had avoided the worst illnesses, began to harden. Not into invincibility, but into something close to durability. These survivors carried scars, inside and out. They had lost siblings. They had watched friends burn with fever and never wake. But they were alive. And in the Middle Ages, that was no small thing. By adolescence, their life expectancy, if calculated from that point forward, jumped dramatically. A 15-year-old who had already dodged smallpox and dysentery could reasonably expect to see 40, 50, even 60 winters. Some lived longer. Old age was not a fantasy. It was a quiet reward for surviving the lottery. But here is where the suspense deepens. Those longer lives were not gentle. They were carved from relentless labor, chronic pain, and the slow wearing down of joints and teeth and eyesight. A woman who survived childbirth a dozen times might live to 50, but her body would remember every single delivery. A man who worked the fields from age 7 would have hands like twisted roots by 40. The survivors didn't thrive. They endured. And endurance came with its own quiet cost. They watched their own children die. They buried friends. They learned to love without clinging, to hope without expecting. The medieval adult who reached old age was not naive. They were veterans of a war that never ended. And they carried something else too, a strange, unspoken awareness that their survival was arbitrary. Why them and not their brother? Why this year and not the last? That question never left them. It hung in the air every time they held a new grandchild, every time a fever swept through the village, every time winter arrived and someone did not wake up. So yes, many medieval people lived longer than 30, but their longer lives were shaped by loss in ways we struggle to imagine. And that raises one final, uncomfortable question. Why did some people have better odds than others? Why did a noble's child have a fighting chance while a peasant's child often had none? That difference was not luck. It was design. And that is exactly where we turn next. That difference was not luck. It was design. And that is exactly where we turn next. Because in the Middle Ages, your life expectancy was written before you took your first breath. Not in the stars. In your social class. A noble child born into a stone castle with warm furs, fresh meat, and servants to fetch clean water had already won half the battle before it even began. Their mother rested during pregnancy. Their crib was watched. When fever came, there was a healer nearby, someone who had seen the illness before. Did that guarantee survival? No. Plague did not care about titles, but it nudged the odds. And in a world where survival was a game of inches, a nudge was everything. Now consider the peasant child born in a damp wattle and daub hut. The same winter wind that chilled the noble's hallway froze the peasant's single room. The same bad harvest that made noble bread slightly coarser meant the peasant's family starved for months. The same fever that weakened a lord's daughter killed a farmer's son, because there was no one to sit with him through the night. Everyone had to work. Everyone had to keep going. That is the cruel mathematics of medieval life expectancy. It was not distributed evenly. It was distributed according to how much your body was allowed to rest, how often your belly was full, and how many times you could avoid the injuries that came from brutal, endless labor. And then there is the other divide, the one we hesitate to speak aloud. Women bore a burden that men never faced. Each pregnancy was a door that opened onto either life or silence. Even the strongest woman, well-fed and carefully tended, could bleed out in an hour. Now imagine that same woman, malnourished, exhausted, already raising 4 children, pregnant again because survival required more hands. The risk did not come once. It came again and again. And each time, the body remembered. Each time, the odds whispered differently. Some women survived a dozen births and lived to see grey hair. Others died with their first, their second, their fifth. There was no way to know which you would be until the moment arrived. And that uncertainty, that intimate, repeated gamble with death, shaped every woman's life in ways no man could fully understand. So when we ask why medieval life expectancy was so low, we are really asking a different question. Whose lives were we counting? The powerful few who ate well and rested, or the many who wore themselves down until nothing was left? The answer, as always, is both. But the weight of that average fell heaviest on those who had no say in the matter. And that truth, perhaps more than any number, is the real story of the Middle Ages.